They called security and forced her off the flight, thinking that was the end of it. They had no idea she was about to take over everything. Zara Hastings knew the value of time. She had built her career on it, securing high-stakes aviation finance deals, negotiating under pressure, and ensuring that every decision she made counted. Today was no different, dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer and crisp white blouse. She walked into lax with purpose. Her flight to Phoenix was just under 2 hours. An easy trip for a meeting that could change everything. She checked in, passed through security, and grabbed a quick coffee before heading to her gate. Everything was routine until it wasn't. The moment she stepped onto the plane, a shift in energy pulled her attention. A flight attendant mid-40s, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, gave her a look, not a standard professional glance, but something else. Something assessing. Zara had encountered this before. The unspoken tension, the silent question. Do you belong here? She ignored it. There were deals to close, numbers to finalize. She just wanted to sit, review her notes, and get to her destination. As she walked down the aisle, she glanced at her boarding pass again. Seat 3, a first class. She reached her row and placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment. Just as she settled into her seat, the same flight attendant approached, a forced smile stretching across her face. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again. Zara blinked. She had literally just shown it at the entrance. But she kept her composure, pulling out her phone and displaying her digital ticket. The attendant barely glanced at it before responding. There seems to be a mistake. This seat is already assigned to another passenger. A pause. Zara tilted her head slightly. No, it's not. 3A is mine. I booked it weeks ago. The flight attendant exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across her face. Let me check with the gate agent. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. Zara leaned back, tapping her fingers against the armrest. This wasn't new. She had spent years navigating spaces where people didn't expect her, boardrooms filled with men who assumed she was an assistant, meetings where she was spoken over until she made it clear she controlled the numbers. But this was different. This was public, and it was about to escalate. A few moments later, the flight attendant returned, this time with a male colleague. He looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't want to be here. Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to step off the plane. The air in the cabin shifted. Zara heard a few murmurs. A couple across the aisle turned their heads. She sat up straighter. Excuse me. There's been an issue with your ticket. We need you to debark so we can sort it out. The words were professional, but the tone wasn't. There was no discussion, no alternative offered, just a demand. Zara took a slow breath. I'm not stepping off until you explain why. My confirmed seat is suddenly an issue. The flight attendant folded her arms, the friendly act completely gone. You're being uncooperative. We need you to leave that word uncooperative, a trigger word, used to paint a simple disagreement as defiance, to turn her into the problem. Passengers were watching now. A man in business casual frowned. A woman near the window whispered something to her seatmate. Zara could feel the moment hanging in the air, heavy charged. Then before she could respond, the male flight attendant spoke into his radio security. Zara clenched her jaw. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about power, about showing her that no matter how qualified, how composed, how prepared she was, they could still make her small. 2 security officers arrived within minutes. The lead officer, a burly man with a tired expression, approached her seat. Ma'am, please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. There was no arguing now. She had a choice. Stand her ground and risk an unnecessary scene, or walk away with her dignity intact. She stood slowly, lifting her bag from the overhead bin. The moment stretched. Every set of eyes was on her. As she turned, she met the flight attendant's gaze one last time. The woman didn't look triumphant. She looked indifferent. Like this was just another task in her shift. Zara walked off the plane in silence. But this wasn't over. Zara Hastings stepped into the terminal, her grip tightening around the handle of her carry-on. The fluorescent lights above hummed, a dull contrast to the heat simmering in her chest. She had just been humiliated in front of dozens of passengers, dismissed as if she didn't belong, as if her presence was an inconvenience. And for what a power trip! A personal bias disguised as airline protocol. She took a breath, steadying herself. This wasn't the time to react emotionally. She had built her career on thinking, several moves ahead, on never letting people see her falter if they thought they had just put her in her place. They were about to learn they had underestimated the wrong person. Pulling out her phone, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she needed. She hit dial. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Zara, you're calling me at airport hours." "This should be good," she exhaled sharply, a bitter smirk tugging at her lips. "You could say that I need a favor." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "What happened?" She told him every detail. From the moment she stepped onto the plane, to the security officers escorting her out, she kept her voice level professional. But she knew him well, enough to hear the shift in his tone. "Which airline?" he asked. Zara let the name roll off her tongue. There was a pause, then "Give me 10 minutes." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. "Appreciate it." She hung up, tucking her phone back into her pocket. She could already feel the shift in momentum. The anger still simmered, but now it was mixed with something sharper. Control, because she wasn't just another passenger. Kicked off a flight, she wasn't a name they could erase from a flight manifest and forget about. Zara Hastings wasn't just in aviation finance. She was a key player in it. Her network stretched from boardrooms to hedge funds, from investors to corporate insiders. She knew who pulled the strings and, more importantly, how to make them tighten around the right throats. Still, the humiliation lingered. She glanced around the terminal, taking in the blur of movement. People checking flight boards, sipping overpriced coffee, dragging suitcases to their gates. A woman about her age, mid-30s, met her gaze for a brief second before looking away. Not out of disinterest, but discomfort. People had watched it happen. Some had seen the injustice. But no one had spoken up. Zara clenched her jaw. She wasn't naive. She knew how these things played out. But knowing and experiencing were two different things. Then her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw a text. "Check your email." She did. And there it was, an internal memo sent straight to her, forwarded from one of the airline's top executives. Subject line: "Immediate attention needed. Incident on Flight 276. She scanned the email. The flight she was supposed to be on had only been in the air for 20 minutes. And yet corporate was already scrambling, because this wasn't just about a flight attendant kicking someone off a plane. This was about who they had kicked off. Zara took a slow breath, tilting her head slightly. They thought this was just another day, another inconvenience dealt with. They had no idea what was coming. Zara stood near a row of empty chairs in the terminal, her eyes flicking between the email on her screen and the oblivious passengers boarding their flights. The airlines. Top brass had already been pulled into the situation, and she hadn't even spoken a word to them yet. She could almost picture it. The executives in their glass-walled conference rooms, clutching their coffee cups, realizing that they had just made a very costly mistake. Her phone vibrated in her hand. A new message: they're calling an emergency meeting. "Give it 5 minutes." She let out a small breath. They were fast, but not fast enough. The damage was already spreading. Because Zara wasn't just some disgruntled passenger. She was a name in the aviation finance world. She sat in rooms where airline mergers were debated, where aircraft leases were structured, where billion-dollar deals were signed, and the airline had just ejected her from a flight, like she was a problem to be removed. She scrolled through her emails again, then glanced at her notifications, Twitter, LinkedIn, even a few texts from industry colleagues. People were talking. A reporter from a major business magazine had already reached out. A low, satisfied hum sat in her chest. She hadn't said a word publicly, but the story was writing itself. Then another call came in. She recognized the number instantly. Corporate, she answered, keeping her voice neutral. This is Zara, Miss Hastings. The man on the other end sounded slightly out of breath. We were just made aware of an incident on one of our flights. I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding. She didn't answer right away. Let the silence stretch, let him squirm. Misunderstanding. She finally repeated, her tone cool. I was removed from my seat, humiliated in front of an entire cabin of passengers. And now that the headlines are coming, you're calling me with a half-baked apology. The man cleared his throat. I assure you we take these matters seriously. We're already investigating what happened. Zara let out a short breath through her nose. They weren't calling because they cared. They were calling because they were scared. Good, she said, glancing at the email again then. You already know this isn't going away. A hesitation, Miss Hastings. We'd love the opportunity to discuss this matter privately. Perhaps we can arrange a conversation with our senior leadership. She cut him off. You'll be having a conversation, all right, but not with me. Silence. Then a cautious I'm sorry. Zara smirked. I don't need an apology. I need your board of directors to get ready. Another silence, this one heavier. She could almost hear the realization clicking into place. On the other end, they had picked the worst possible person to mistreat. The man stammered out another line about wanting to make things right, but Zara was already done with the call. She ended it mid-sentence. Then with steady hands she pulled up a new contact, the investor group that was already looking to acquire a stake in the airline. She hit dial, and just like that, the game changed. Zara tapped her foot against the tile floor, the call ringing twice before a deep, confident voice answered. I was wondering when you'd reach out. She smirked. You heard. Let's just say your name is circulating in some interesting places right now, and not just in aviation circles. The media picked up on it fast. An executive forcibly removed from a flight. They love that kind of mess. She exhaled sharply. Good, because I have a proposition. The man on the other end, Charles Mendez, was a key player in corporate acquisitions. He didn't deal in small-scale ventures. He orchestrated billion-dollar takeovers. I'm listening. Zara glanced around the terminal, making sure no one was too close. Then she lowered her voice. This airline stock is about to drop. The PR fallout is only beginning. And once the headlines hit, investors are going to panic. The board will scramble to reassure them, but they'll be bleeding money before they know what hit them. And you want to be the one holding the knife. A corner of her mouth lifted. Not quite. I want to be the one holding the lifeline. She had been eyeing a potential investment in the airline. For months they were struggling internally. Mismanaged budgets, outdated policies, and a lack of innovation. But now they were vulnerable. And vulnerable companies were ripe for takeovers. How much control are you looking for? Charles asked, his voice sharp. All business enough to make the necessary changes. I don't just want a stake. I want influence, seats on the board, decision-making power that's ambitious. She smiled. You wouldn't expect anything less from me. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. I'll make some calls. Let's see how many shareholders are ready to jump ship. If the numbers look right, we move in. Zara nodded. I'll be waiting. She ended the call and tucked her phone away. The terminal buzzed around her, but she was somewhere else entirely, mentally plotting, calculating the next steps. Because this wasn't just about what had happened to her on that plane. This was about making sure it never happened again. But first she had to take control. 2 weeks later, Zara Hastings walked through the same airport. But this time everything was different. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't a woman being forced off a flight, humiliated in front of strangers. She was the new owner of the airline. The hostile takeover had happened fast, faster than anyone expected. The moment the news of her removal hit the press, the airline stock took a nosedive. Investors panicked. The board held emergency meetings, scrambling to reassure shareholders that the situation was being handled. But no one trusted a sinking ship. Zara, alongside Charles and a coalition of key investors, swooped in at the perfect moment. They started acquiring shares in silence, watching as executives made desperate attempts to control a situation already spiraling beyond their grasp. And then one by one board members folded. Within 10 days, the airline's leadership changed hands. The previous CEO was forced out. The flight operations director resigned. A complete internal restructuring was announced. And Zara, she wasn't just sitting on the board. She was running the show now, walking through the airport terminal. She wasn't the woman they had underestimated. She wasn't a name they could brush aside. She was their boss. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the private executive lounge, a space she now had unrestricted access to. And then she saw her, the flight attendant, the same woman who had smirked as security escorted her off the plane, the one who had spoken to her like she was less than. She was standing near the check-in counter, adjusting her uniform, oblivious to the shift in power. Zara slowed her steps just enough to be seen. The woman looked up and froze. For a brief second, her expression flickered between recognition and panic. Zara said nothing at first. She let the silence do the work, let the weight of the moment settle. Then, with the kind of calm authority that couldn't be faked, she spoke. "You work for me now." The flight attendant's face paled. I was just following policy." Zara raised a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to make something clear." The woman swallowed hard. Passengers bustled around them, unaware of the power shift happening in real time. "I don't care about what you thought that day," Zara continued, her voice smooth, steady. "I care about what happens next." She let the words hang. "You can either learn from this," Zara said, tilting her head slightly, "or you can pack your things." The flight attendant didn't move, didn't speak. Zara held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Because real power wasn't in humiliating someone. It was in giving them a choice and watching them realize they no longer held any control. Zara didn't look back as she walked toward the executive lounge. She didn't need to. The weight of the moment was already settled. And the flight attendant knew it. But this wasn't about revenge. It had never been about getting even. That would have been too small, too temporary. This was about changing the game. She entered the lounge, stepping into a world of glass walls, leather seating, and quiet conversations between industry power players. She belonged here. She had always belonged here. The difference was that now no one could question it. She took a seat by the window, watching the runway below as planes taxied in and out. The same airline that had dismissed her 2 weeks ago now moved at her command. Her phone buzzed. A message from Charles. "Press conference set for tomorrow. Time to show them what leadership looks like." Zara exhaled, setting her phone down. Yes, it was time. Because leadership wasn't about titles or corporate handshakes. It wasn't about sitting in first-class seats or having a nameplate on a boardroom door. It was about who made the decisions when it mattered. She had a vision for this airline, not just for herself, but for the people who had been treated like she was. The ones who had been dismissed, overlooked, made to feel like they weren't enough. That culture was about to end. Because change wasn't just about firing the wrong people. It was about hiring the right ones. Creating an industry where respect wasn't just an option. She had power now, and she wasn't going to waste it. As she watched another plane take off into the evening sky, Zara allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Some people spent their lives gatekeeping power. She had taken it, and she wasn't letting go. Lesson learned. Never underestimate the person you try to silence. Because one day, they might be the ones signing your paycheck. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. More real-life lessons. More stories that keep you thinking. Because power shifts faster than you think.